So the trade deadline has come and gone. Today we found out a lot of things about a lot of teams and didn't find a lot of things from other teams. The Utah Jazz were somewhere in the middle as they did end up making two trades, both of them being slightly interesting and only one of them being mildly anticipated. However, there were a lot more questions than there were answers after the deadline. In this video, we'll be covering some of those questions and seeing if we can find some answers. With that being said, thanks for tuning in. This one, it's your boy Ray Thoops. Like the video, subscribe, and turn on post notifications if you like the Utah Jazz. And without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into this one. Now, today we saw only one transaction end up going down with the Utah Jazz. We were put in a situation where we thought they were going to be making a big play, whether it have been DeJounte Murray or Mikal Bridges or just another piece. At one point, we thought we were going to get Quentin Grimes. However, he ended up going to a different team as well. This was a situation where you expected certain things to happen from the Utah Jazz because they were quoted as being buyers and sellers, or at the very least expected to be at the deadline, but they just ended up being sellers, it seemed like. You saw Fontecchio go to the Pistons, and at first it seemed like a wasted move by the Pistons, but the Pistons got super active at the deadline, being today, and really made some plays to go ahead and make their team better. With that being said, we thought the Utah Jazz were going to follow suit in a similar way, because in that trade in particular, it just seemed like a little bit of a removal of a decently important piece in Fontecchio, who was a very solid marksman and did a lot of the dirty work and didn't complain, a really good glue guy. In order to make way for some of the rookies' minutes, ideally it would be Taylor Hendricks, but then we saw today's trade and it was confusing. It ended up in a situation where the Utah Jazz ended up gaining Kyra Lewis Jr. and Otto Porter Jr., and as well as a future first-round pick from the Toronto Raptors, and in exchange for Ochai Agbaji and Kelly Olynyk. Now, we had anticipated that Kelly would eventually get traded, but the other two people that seemed to be the hottest on the market were going to be THT and Jordan Clarkson. The easiest thing that we can identify and get out of the way now is why exactly THT didn't get traded. The simple fact of the matter is he's going to be an unrestricted free agent after this year. He was already on a player option that he decided to exercise going into this year, and since he's been racking up DNPs, some teams understand his value, but they also understand he might not end up staying in Utah after this season. The odds that he decides to re-sign and just ride the bench, because effectively there is no great role for him on this team, is highly unlikely. Again, at least Keontae George and Chris Dunn are ahead of him. If you don't want to sit there and say that Colin Sexton is also ideally ahead of him in a perfect situation. It puts you in a situation where a lot of teams aren't willing to just go ahead and risk it to trade for him when they can just get him in free agency for a decent price. Moving on to Jordan Clarkson, it was announced slightly before the deadline by an insider that they would likely end up keeping him past the deadline. And to a certain extent, that makes sense. He is the longest tenured player on the roster. He does have good games from time to time. And when he's hot, he's hot. He can go nuclear. And he's a really big culture guy. Now, you might sit there and say, what kind of culture is he kind of bringing to the Utah Jazz, considering the fact that he can have a really hot night and have a really cold night, by comparison to like Colin Sexton, who also has a decently large ego, but Colin Sexton plays the exact same way when you're down 30 and up 30. In that same vein though, we have to understand that he is a relative icon for the team, and there were some other precious guards that ended up getting traded around right there before the deadline that also kind of alleviated the stress for other teams that were potential trade targets for Jordan Clarkson. Once their needs were satiated by other players and other teams that were looking to get super active, it put us in a situation where there also wasn't that many trade partners that would be willing to offer that much to get him. So in that sense, it does make sense to go ahead and keep him for that scoring punch. Also, considering the fact that you depleted your bench by trading away Ochai as well as Kelly Olynyk, it puts you in a headspace where you understand you still need to have something coming off of the bench, at the very least, until you can get the rest of the guys up to speed and put them into a position to succeed. Otto Porter is an expiring contract. Kevin Knox is an expiring contract. Gabriel Pregida from the Fontecchio trade, who's currently in the EuroLeague, isn't quite up to standard just yet, but at the young age of being in his early 20s, he still has time to develop. So there's no major expectation from him. But then the question becomes, what was the goal of this trade deadline? Because it puts you in a situation where you have a lot of guys that are still going to be on the books next year. You have John Collins next year going for $26.5 million. You have Jordan Clarkson going for $14 million. You have Colin Sexton going for $18 million. And you have Markkanen going for $18 million. And you still probably will go ahead and re-sign him next year and probably parlay some of that money into that last year of his deal. Kelly Olynyk made sense because he was an expiring contract. THT they kept, and he's an expiring contract. Chris Dunn is going to be an expiring contract, but it's likely that they are going to re-sign him and give him a little bit of a pay bump, considering the fact that he's only making $2.5 million this year. In that same vein, you have the second year of the Omer year 7 deal where he's getting $2.6 million. You have Walker Kessler in another year of his contract getting $2.9 million. And while Ochai had another year of his contract, it did make sense that they felt if he was not going to be a core part of their future, and if he had not shown enough development in the short and very specific role that they had him in on this particular team. Keyonte George is still having time on his books, and Taylor Hendricks as well, obviously, with them both being rookies, as well as Bryce Sensabaugh. With that being said, though, you have Lucas Solmanich, who's going to be an expiring deal. You have Johnny Juzang, you have Micah Potter, and you have Jason Preston, who are all on dual deals. Now, with that being said, it puts you into a position where you're basically looking like you're cleaning house. Now, Danny Ainge came into this trade deadline, and we were under the impression that he was going to be a buyer and a seller. Now, I'm guessing that he just didn't see a deal that he really liked, and that's what ultimately it came down to. But he was planning on removing some pieces from the table anyways. Now, he did get a little bit of draft compensation. Again, he got a second-round pick as well as a first-round pick, both of which are going to have decent placement. But him stockpiling a treasure trove of picks really wasn't what we were hoping for and wasn't what we were expecting. Again, most sources said that they weren't going to be coming into this trade deadline looking to get draft compensation. They were looking for pieces that could last long-term for them and essentially build them into a contender the fastest. Getting draft picks, it doesn't necessarily do that. With that being said, though, I'm willing to entertain the possibility that Danny Ainge, as the front office manager that we know him to be, it makes sense that he knows what he's doing and he has a vision for this squad. With that being said, though, the front court has been mildly depleted. In a situation where I saw Fontecchio getting traded, the idea was that either Taylor Hendricks gets the start or Ochai Agbaji gets the opportunity to prove that he deserves to be part of the long-term future of this team. Well, very next day, not even 12 hours later, they sent Ochai packing. So that puts them in a situation, again, where ideally you'd like to think that Taylor Hendricks has to be the guy that's going to get minutes now at the very least, because you don't have another wing player to play at that small forward spot. And maybe you decided to go ahead and roll out a lineup tonight, particularly against the Phoenix Suns, where you're going to have Colin Sexton, you still have Chris Dunn, Lowry, and then maybe you decide to go John Collins slid back to the power forward spot and Walker Kessler at the 5, because you effectively lost one big that was really solid and a key member of the second unit's rotation, and effectively that distributor and Kelly Olynyk, who really did most of his damage as seen and put on display against the Milwaukee Bucks. And then you also lost the other bench defensive wing piece that was Ochai Agbaji. So now you have Jordan Clarkson and Keyonte George, who are going to be rough on defense, again, coming off the bench. And now you're going to have a lot of other guys that aren't going to be expected to be on the roster past this season. Now, with that being said, there's just a little bit more context to be given to the particular players that were traded for to go ahead and do our due diligence. With that being said, Otto Porter has played in 15 games this season for the Toronto Raptors. He's averaged 11.6 minutes during those games. Now he averages 2.6 points, shooting 42.4% from the field and 34.8% from 3. He also averaged 1.9 rebounds, 0.5 assists, and 0.1 turnovers to go along with 0.3 steals and 0.3 blocks. Overall, those numbers don't jump off the page. That doesn't mean that Otto Porter Jr. is a trash player, because he's not by any stretch of the imagination, but we've come to know him as a bit of a journeyman as of late. And so the expectation is that you don't see anything too crazy out of him. Does he play spot minutes? Probably. Is he a decent rotation piece at this point just to get you to the end of the season? Yes, most likely. But the chemistry's gone with this squad. You still have the starters for the most part, with the exception of Fontecchio, and you still have the bench guards. So in that sense, they still have a certain level of camaraderie, but continually breaking the team apart and fragmenting what really was one of the most beautiful sets that we've ever seen for this team. It was such an egoless version of basketball. And that's not to say they added somebody that has an ego, because they didn't, but they just added a bunch of extra characters, if that makes sense. Now, I believe that from my understanding of what Kevin Knox in particular has been doing as of late, he could potentially end up earning an extra couple of years in a contract, but that remains to be seen, and I'll explain why in a moment. With that being said, though, Otto Porter Jr. is going to be a decent piece to just have on the bench. I don't know if we actually have him active. I can believe that Omer Yurt 7 is definitely going to be getting more minutes now, obviously because Kelly Olynyk got pulled out, and we're probably going to have Walker Kessler actually burn some more minutes now as well. So it kind of goes in line roughly with how Walker Kessler's minutes went last season, where he was playing mid-20s, but at that point he was coming off the bench because the type of player that they expected him to be. And then once they put him in a starting role, he really blossomed a little bit more. We've seen some good strides from him, but we haven't seen him put it completely together over the entirety of a game or over the entirety of a couple games. So with that being said, I believe that he'll get some more burn. Omer will get some more burn and quality minutes, which Omer will obviously appreciate, but we'll get to see more of Walker Kessler. And hopefully, as long as he's aggressive on the offensive glass, and also finishes at the rim strong, dunking more so than going for finesse layups, things might be a little bit more promising than we originally think they will be. Now, Kira Lewis Jr. this season with the Toronto Raptors has played in 16 games. He's averaged 9.1 minutes and put together 2.8 points, 0.9 rebounds, 1.1 assists, 0.3 steals, and 0.1 blocks to go along with 0.5 turnovers. Now, he shot 30.8% from the field on just 3.3 field goal attempts per game and 10% from the three-point line on 1.3 attempts per game. With that being said, he does shoot 90.9% from the free throw line, again, on 0.7 free throw attempts, so there's not much to be diagnosed there except understanding that he was on the team and he did get some little minutes here and there. Could they potentially see him in a role that allows him to do a little bit more? Perhaps. I'm not necessarily bought in on that theory, but I believe that everybody deserves an opportunity, and since we didn't trade any guards in particular, I find it hard to believe that at his small frame and stature, he ends up getting a significant opportunity to stay with this team. Kevin Knox is the most creative piece that came in, with the exception of obviously the first and second round draft picks, because he has the largest sample size of data to show from. And again, he was originally believed to be one of the top players in his original 2018 draft class. He's played in 31 games for the Detroit Pistons. He averaged 18.1 minutes. He averaged 7.2 points during that time period on 46.2% shooting from the field, 33% shooting from three on 3 attempts, and 90.9% shooting from the free throw line on 0.7 attempts. With that being said, he also had 2.4 rebounds, 0.7 assists, 0.4 steals, 0.2 blocks, and 0.7 turnovers. Admittedly, those numbers aren't particularly great and they don't necessarily jump off the page, but that is something. And then an 18-minute sample size, it's pretty reasonable to understand that he was a decent role player for these guys, and he didn't do anything particularly great, but he did a lot of things decent enough to stay on the roster. I think that a player like him could find a home with the Utah Jazz, considering that the type of players that we did end up giving up, just to have him there as a utility piece, maybe a little bit of a Swiss Army knife. Obviously, we didn't get back anybody that shoots as well as Fontecchio does, so we're going to be hurting a little bit from that standpoint, but I could see a situation where Taylor Hendricks ends up getting pulled up and gets to start, and then you also see a situation where Kevin Knox ends up getting a significant amount of bench minutes. With that being said, it remains to be seen whether Lucas Salmonic gets some more opportunities. It was made very interesting news that he ended up playing before garbage time in the most recent game against the Oklahoma City Thunder. He actually played during the first half, which was a significant number of minutes, all things considered, because usually he only plays in garbage time alongside THT or Omer Yurtseven. With that said, there's going to be a lot that comes into this upcoming section of the season. We all pictured the Utah Jazz to be somewhere in the playoff picture, whether it be in the play-in games or as high as the 6th seed for me personally. After the trade deadline, I'm not so sure about that. And honestly, it won't be until the end of February that I know for concrete certain what this team is capable of. That said, you still have your dynamic duo of Colin Sexton and Larry Markkinen. Ideally, you'd like to think that Keontae George continues to build on his recent stroke of good play. Chris Dunn is obviously a great point of attack defender, a great table setter, and he ends up also hitting his shots very timely. Add to the mix the fact that John Collins has found his niche as an aggressive rebounder, a strong finisher at the rim. His three-point shooting has been struggling a little bit, but defensively, he's also been in the places that he's needed to be a little bit more effective and not seem like he doesn't care. With that being said, Jordan Clarkson will hopefully be slightly more consistent, or at the very least remain where he has been recently for the team. And if he does have an inconsistent game, Will Hardy at the very least pulls him from that game and doesn't let him keep squandering out and floundering. Give some minutes to somebody that's actually going to be more productive than he will in those situations. And likely, I think THT will probably continue to rack up DNPs. At the very least, we might let him play a couple of games in particular for very injury riddled, or in tonight's game against the Phoenix Suns, I could see him playing, just because there's a lot of minutes that have to be reallocated. Johnny might also catch a couple more minutes. I could see that happening. Micah Potter also has that opportunity. And obviously Walker Kessler is naturally going to get more minutes. Now, there's a little bit more pressure on Walker Kessler on defense with that second unit. And honestly, depending on how they decide to roll out their units and how they decide to do the rotations for the remainder of the season, things are going to get really interesting, because you could see a situation where Otto Porter plays a bigger role on this team than he did on the previous team, being the Toronto Raptors. And while that might not necessarily be a bad thing, it is a thing nevertheless. I would like to say that Kevin Knox going out right now, at the very least, seems to be the most promising of pieces that we got, despite the fact that he's on an expiring contract as well. And the vision of Danny Ainge does make a little bit more sense to me now after poring over the data and looking at what these guys are. I didn't think that he was going to end up taking this route because originally the information that we got again told us that we were going to be buyers and sellers. But knowing Danny Ainge and understanding that he's not going to overpay for anything, it makes sense that he wasn't going to go ahead and just overcompensate a team like the Atlanta Hawks that had very strict understanding of what they wanted for DeJounte Murray. In a similar sense, you had the Nets that were being very stingy with Mikal Bridges despite their lack of genuine direction that a lot of people are seeing. And it puts you in a headspace that makes you think maybe he's eyeing next year. Maybe he's comfortable with conveying next year's pick instead of conveying this year's pick to the Oklahoma City Thunder because, again, it is top 10 protected. With that being said, I would like to stay in the playoff picture, and I believe, like all other fans do, they don't want to sit here and just fall by the wayside. Considering that they still have Larry Markkinen and Colin Sexton, those were the two key pieces that kept the engine going, alongside John Collins and his effective rebounding. You still have Chris Dunn table setting and making sure that the job gets done, but you no longer have Fonteku to fill in a couple gaps. On the bench, you can hope that Keontae George continues to get better. You can hope that Jordan Clarkson remains consistent, and you can hope that Walker Kessler continues to clean up the glass, defend the rim, and really just become more aggressive himself. But then you just filling in the cracks with these other pieces that you got, and it's going to take them a little bit of time to get some chemistry with all the rest of the boys, especially under the understanding that they might not be here after the season and they might not see a point in honestly giving chemistry. I think at worst, this move allows for them to open up minutes for the possibility of seeing Bryce Sensabaugh this season, as we've only seen him all of a handful of games, and then actually see a decent sample size and a true rotation piece sample size of Taylor Hendricks, who I think is really going to be a sneaky good player. Admittedly, some people think that he's a bust just because he played a lot of games in G League, when it was because he had untimely injuries that kept him out of the summer league games, and leading into the preseason, he was just left out of the rotation because there wasn't as much of a need for him. Ideally, if you're in a situation, originally people thought that John Collins was going to be gone by the trade deadline, and then Olynyk as well, so big minutes would have been available for him. But even with Olynyk out, you're still looking at about 20 minutes that have to be reallocated, and I think that Taylor Hendricks is going to be the biggest beneficiary of this trade deadline. With that being said, you guys let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll end up dropping a video about Taylor Hendricks and what my expectations for him will be after we see if he's going to be getting these minutes specifically and how many it's going to be. And if there's any more news coming up about the implications of these trades from Jazz insiders, or what Danny Ainge and the front office decides to do coming into this offseason, you guys will be the first to know on this channel, so go ahead and smash that subscribe button. With that being said, let me know your thoughts below. Let me know if you thought this was a W or an L trade deadline for the Utah Jazz. I lean middle of the road. I don't think it's a perfect W. I also don't think it's necessarily a complete L. With that being said, our returns were kind of mediocre, but they have a specific purpose, so that means that they're not necessarily a loss for us. With that being said, go ahead and subscribe, turn on those post notifications, like the video, become a member to support the channel, and let me know what you hope the Utah Jazz do the rest of the season and where you think they could potentially end up in the playoff picture, if you think they can make the playoffs still at all. With that being said, it's your boy Ray Thoops. Thanks for tuning in this video. As always, good morning, good evening, good night, and whenever you're on the globe watching, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.